There we go. G'day, everyone, and welcome to our 2022 webinar series. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. The same as last year, we aim to do these webinars at least weekly, but the days and times do vary. So head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find all our upcoming events. I know we've got more than 720 people registered for today's webinar. Thank you so much for joining us. And we'll get started very shortly, but just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly today. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for our panel, and you should also be able to upvote questions from other people and make comments as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out like we did to a troll that we had last week. And thank you to all of you for being on the lookout for anyone who's trying to muck up the chat for the rest of us. A reminder, lastly, that this discussion is being recorded and will be posted on the Australia Institute website after this discussion. I'm absolutely delighted to introduce you to our two guests today. Allan Behm is Director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program. Allan's got long experience in international policy, national security policy, and defence policy. And of course, he's the author of the new book, No Enemies, No Friends, Restoring Australia's Global Relevance. Today, Allan's going to be in conversation with Melissa Conley-Tyler, Program Lead at the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, or AP4D. Melissa served as National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs for some 13 years. And some of you might remember that we spoke to Melissa last year about attitudes towards security here and in Taiwan. And this book really could not come at a better time. We've all been watching on in horror as Russia invaded Ukraine and alarmingly heard that the Russian president has put the country's nuclear forces on alert. So we do find ourselves at a perilous global moment where obviously much more attention has turned to national security. And in No Enemies, No Friends, Allan writes that the orthodoxy that increased defence spending will deliver increased national security really confirms the status quo, but does not help us to deal with shocks and surprises. And of course, we're living through a time of a lot of global disruption. This book also interrogates Australia's values and why we feel so insecure, and asks, how should Australia recalibrate its national security settings to deal with global disruption? No Enemies, No Friends is published by Upswell. It's available in all good bookstores. Allan, congratulations on the book and welcome. And I'm going to hand over to Melissa now.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And look, I mean, Allan, you paint a pretty unflattering picture of Australian foreign policy in this book. You talk about Australia being perceived in the world as heartless, hypercritical and mean-spirited. You talk about bluster and braggadocio and, essentially Australia is a bumbling spectator on the world scene. Can you take us through some of the examples of missteps that has given you that?
There are so many, I'm not quite sure where to start, but just for the sake of convenience, I'll start with the early 60s. After we'd had a period of almost nothing happening in Australia, and that came after we'd been a really big player in the formation of the United Nations. So we all went to sleep for a while. And then suddenly along came an opportunity to get ourselves involved in the decolonisation of Vietnam. And so we rushed in support of a war in Vietnam, which was a really serious error in foreign policy. But more than that, it was a serious error in strategic policy. We did not make that error when the decolonisation of Indonesia was underway in the very, very late years of the 1940s. And yet by the 1960s, we'd forgotten that and we got ourselves into a quagmire. And our exit from there was ignominious, to say the least. But that's not the only one. I mean, we've continued to get ourselves involved in foreign conflicts ever since. And our withdrawal and the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan most recently is yet another element in a procession of what we would call defence and strategic blunders. Our foreign policy, though, in its execution has been not much better. We have rushes of blood to the head. We do really good things for a while. We get in and work hard on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, or work hard in the Cairns Group and help in the formation of the GATT. And then the moment we have a triumph like that, the centrifugal forces of domestic politics take over, we fall in on ourselves, forget what we've achieved and walk away from it. And we've done this in Papua New Guinea, which is a disgrace for Australian policy, in the Pacific, which is another disgrace for Australian international policy, not to mention our development policy. In Southeast Asia more broadly, we've done the same sorts of things. We blow hot and cold in Africa, and we pretend that South America just doesn't exist. So in all of this, our performance at best can said to be spotty, but I don't think it's just spotty. I think it's inept and bumbling, and we've got to fix it.
Okay. And one of the explanations for this that you give in the book is that we've really lessened our investment in our diplomatic capacity and our development capacity. I mean, and that's over a number of governments, as you're saying, not just recently. Why do you think this is?
I think there are a lot of factors in this, and I shouldn't be telling you what they are, because you've been involved in development policy for longer than I have, really. It's a function of a lot of different things, but for me, it comes back to a central issue. We're not sure of who we are, and we don't know what we stand for. And if you haven't got a good answer for both of those sorts of things, you're not then able to prioritise how you're going to invest what funds you do have out of your public purse into all of the things that you're going to want, if you are a trier, to make a difference in. So it's been easy since, and I think we can put a date on it, I think it is 1996, that we began the process of winding down our investment in both our diplomatic effort and in our overseas development assistance effort. And that comes maybe generates a saving to the budget, but it comes at great cost. It comes at a great cost because not only do we lessen our connectivity with the countries of the Pacific and of Southeast Asia, but more importantly, we generate the image that we are a mean and heartless community living the life of Riley here. We're a very, very endowed country, and yet looking around our region as though their lives and their interests don't matter. And if we were smart, we'd be thinking their lives and their interests really matter, because that's where we're going to get our long-term security from. The better off they are, the better off we will be. It's not a complex thing. What becomes complex is all of the noise and shouting that goes on around these sorts of issues, and we lose our focus because we haven't got something to focus on.
And I think that link with that sense of insecurity, I think that's a very strong theme in the book. I mean, at a deeper level, so many of the problems you're talking about, you trace to what you see as a strategic mindset or a strategic culture, as I put it, which is more fearful or defensive, that, we're not as confident in the world as we could be. I mean, where do you see that coming from?
Look, I think it's very deep in the history of Australia's colonisation by, I dare say, your ancestors and mine. I mean, here we are on a fabulous continent which hosts the oldest living culture in the world, going back 65,000 years. But suddenly we plonk ourselves on this place in 1788, and that's where the problems start. Well, it actually started in 1770, really. I mean, the first thing that Captain Cook did when he hit Botany Bay is shoot a couple of the Gadigal people. Fortunately, he didn't kill them, but buckshot doesn't begin a happy relationship. And in 1788, of course, we arrived here, and it was mostly at the far end of the world. We ran out of food. We were waiting for the second fleet. It came and didn't bring enough with it. So until the third fleet arrived, we had these very, very deep feelings of isolation and insecurity. And I think they have stayed with us ever since. And I might just add, because I know you're going to get into here, that when the first fleet actually arrived here in 1788, it stayed offshore until all of the blokes came on shore and built all of the huts. And then the moment they all came on shore, there was an orgy. It was an absolute bacchanalia. And we're more likely these days to call it a pack rape, because that's what we should see what happened on the first Friday that Australia was colonised by the First Fleet. So that misogyny sits down in the heart of it as well. And I don't think we've ever recovered from it.
Well, on those two issues you mentioned, on Indigenous reconciliation and entrenched sexism in Australia, I mean, we'd often talk about those as domestic issues. That's often how we would say there's this clear distinction between domestic and international. But in the book, you're trying to draw a real connection between them, that the domestic gives you the mindset which you then take into the international. And the way we behave internationally is very much conditioned on the mindset we have domestically. So, I mean, if you could take me through both those issues, I mean, what does it mean if Australia does achieve better reconciliation? You talk a lot about the Uluru Statement from the Heart in the book. Or what would it achieve, for example, if Australia adopted a feminist foreign policy and took that into the world? So I'm interested in what you think we can do on both those areas.
There's a lot to unpack there, a huge amount. So I'll have a go at it, but I reckon that you could have a go at it too, because there are some really important issues on which we've discussed many times. I wrote the book. But there are things that you can say. But look, I start from the position that in order to have agency, that's the capacity to do things. You've got to be an agent. You've got to be able to do things. And you can't do things if you don't know who you are and if you don't know what you value and what you stand for. And if sitting deep under, or not even that far, under the skin of our sort of national body, if in our sort of national mindset, we have a set of pathologies which stop us from knowing who we are and stop us from knowing what we stand for. And I think racism and misogyny and isolation and remoteness and a total incapacity for self-affirmation, which is what the cultural cringe really means, if all of those things are at play, then you've got nowhere to start from. And so what I'm trying to suggest in this book is that if you hold a mirror up to our face and get into our own minds and start thinking about what are the things that limit us from being the kind of country which we could so easily be, then you're in a position to completely transform not only the way you conduct yourself and the image that you have as somebody who has agency, but you can impact on outcomes. And this, I think, is a critically important part of what this book is trying to push. And if you can do that, you generate a really critical continuity between your domestic policy settings and your international policy settings. You see, so often we see international policy as a kind of add-on, that you do it if you can, but if you run out of money, well, it doesn't matter, it's international. Well, that's absolutely wrong. Our domestic policy and our international policy absolutely belong together. Our prosperity depends on the way in which we act with the world. Our security depends on the way in which we act with the world. And I would submit that even things like social security policy, education policy, infrastructure policy, all of these things are deeply connected with the way in which we carry ourselves globally. And I get to take a lot of heart from that, actually, because once you see that connectivity, it gives rhyme and reason to public policy. And that's where I've spent my life.
And it's interesting, I have to say, because I think one of the criticisms that's often made of progressives is, are you proud of this country and its achievements? And reading this, I could tell just how proud you are of so many things. If you look at universal suffrage, at fair pay, the social safety net, and then internationally, the sort of work that's been done on promoting multilateralism, from Hughes to Evatt to Spender, there's a lot to draw on there. I suppose I'm interested in that from your perspective. I mean, what do you think we can bring from that experience into the international sphere? You talk a lot about, for example, Australia as a natural team builder. I'm interested in what that looks like if you take that internationally.
Look, we're a curious lot. We have a huge number of things of which we should be very proud and a huge number of things which we're very good at. I mean, just look at the circumstances in which so many Australians on the eastern seaboard are finding themselves at the moment, all the way effectively from Maryborough to, well, maybe to Bega. We're not quite sure what's going to be on tomorrow.
Exactly.
And in circumstances of massive flood or massive fires, we have an extraordinary capacity for resilience, which you don't see in every country in the world which confronts the kinds of calamities that we do from time to time. So that also is deeply inbuilt into the way in which we
together.
are. Yes,
I think that communalism
that we
is a
have
strong part.
that capacity. And if you watch how we behave when we're behaving at our best internationally, we are really good at it and really influential, not because we're muscled up, but because we're quite smart in the way in which we can talk about the advantages of those kinds of cooperative behaviours. That, I think, was largely the secret of the Cairns Group formation. That was a long time ago now, and maybe people haven't read about it, but it was very successful because it led to a change in the life of so many of the people who live in regional and rural Australia, our farm productivity and the money that was generated, incomes in farms was really important. So, yeah, of course we're good at that. But at the same time, we have all of these other things that play into our insecurities, a lack of uncertainty, and some of the things I get onto later in the book. You know, the deficits. We've got some serious deficits here. We've got a vision deficit.
Well, let me keep going on that, because I really want to talk about that positive vision, you know, that what we can draw on and what we can do. So, I mean, if we had that confidence, that imagination, that leadership that you talk about in the book, you know, that vision of what Australia's role in the world is, can you tell us more about what you'd like to see? What would Australia be doing?
Well, this really is where my concerns about racism and misogyny play right in, because I think that they are also a critical constraint on our ability to have imagination, to have vision, and to build the kind of leadership that we really must have as a relatively small country in terms of population, but quite a powerful country in terms of the range of assets that we have at our disposal. I mean, I try to point out that we actually have very considerable power in Australia. And that's measured not just in the terms of our 13th or 14th ranking economy, but it's measured in terms of things like we've got 8 of our universities that sit in the top 100 in the world. Now, this is on various measures, but we've got really, really fine educational institutions at the tertiary level. We have 4 cities that the rest of the world would love to live in. At least 4, and Canberra, where we are today, is one of them.
At least 4.
Yes, on some scales, habitability, amenity, safety of getting around. I mean, Australia is a very safe country to walk around in. People love being here.
Our institutions,
our institutions, the way in which our law operates, by and large, the way in which our medical services operate, by and large, the way in which our law enforcement services operate. They can be improved, everything can be improved, but by and large, they work well. So there are many things of which we can be proud, and yet they don't come clearly enough into the way in which we carry ourselves. And so what I'm trying to get to is that to flip that, 2 things have got to happen. One is a critical need for us to belong to our own continent, which is what reconciliation will deliver to us. We have a sense of ownership of it. We own everything. We talk about land titles and we like to own our houses, and we think in sort of Roman law terms of where we live as where we own.
Rather than belonging.
Yes, that's not how Indigenous people think about Australia. They belong to the land, and we should be the same. If we belong to it, we'd look after it. We'd love it. We'd protect it. So the first thing is that if we could really seriously learn from the first peoples of Australia, we would be a much, much happier country. But the second is you can't do that if you're a misogynist. And I mean, we teach misogyny everywhere. We teach women how to be misogynists. We teach women how to loathe each other in the same way as men are able to loathe women, and obviously men loathe each other as well. And we can fix that. We can fix that by building respect in as one of our core national values, and building inclusion and inclusiveness as a core national value, so that as we look at each other, We don't look at each other in terms of gender or race. We look at each other in terms of our shared humanity, and we look at each other as co-contributors to the kind of prosperous, happy country that we should ambition to live in. And that's where I take the book. We have no enemies because we're not big enough to afford them. We have no friends because we're not pretty enough to have any. But we can fix that.
Well, let me keep going on the making friends side, because I think a big part of what you're suggesting in the book is engagement in our region, that's absolutely key to our future. And that's an area that, you know, I obviously strongly support. I think you see that, you talk about that as perhaps an antidote to isolation, but if we start with our near region, with Asia and the Pacific, that's where we can change the mindset. So, I mean, tell me more. What's your vision for Australia in Asia and in the Pacific?
Well, I think the first thing we've got to do is to learn something about the world in which we live. We don't know much about our own continent. I've sort of implicitly said that. We own it, but we don't know much about how it works, what its systems are, what its natural systems are. And so, you know, we arrived here in 1788, and the first thing we wanted to do once we settled down is bring in rabbits and foxes and pigs, and we've got feral animals which don't fit here really well and kill the animals that are here. We like to bring in blackberries and all sorts of other plants that destroy our landscapes, and we've got to think through how we belong to that. So that the first thing is we've got to not only know our own environment, but we've got to know the environment in which we stand as a powerful nation. So we've got to get out there. We've got to learn their languages, because language is the key window through which we approach culture. And I deal with that a fair bit when I sort of try to analyse the fact that we use our own cultural experiences as being normative. So we look at Asia and we say, well, that's not how we do things, so they're wrong. You know, we have words like racism, and they don't have a word for racism in most Asian languages. Well, they do now. It's called racism. They borrowed an English word. And it's because we don't often know where some of our key concepts have come from and how normative they have become in our own behaviours. So the first thing is we've got to go there. We've got to learn their languages, but it goes more than that. We've got to know how to participate in their economies, to work with Asian countries in the way in which they're building and expanding their institutions for their purposes. Why should we do that? Because we have built robust institutions. We know how to do that.
We actually have something to offer.
We have a lot to offer. And it's not that we've got to make them build the same thing as we have, you know, a kind of enforced leadership. It's rather that we influence the construction of culturally sensitive institutions in Indonesia and in Thailand and Vietnam and the Philippines, in Papua New Guinea, which is so infinitely complex, and right across the Pacific, which are equally complex, and get in and work collaboratively in establishing the systems by which they are going to be countries marked by well-being and prosperity and happiness. We should use the word happiness all the time.
The human flourishing, that's something we talk about a lot. And that idea that we have a real stake in the region, that we need to think in terms of our shared future. That's something that we at Asia Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue have been doing some work on. We just brought out a range of papers on Southeast Asia, and it's all about that. How do you move your mindset from being a sort of detached outsider to an invested insider? And once you have that mindset, I think things do change.
Look, once you know how mutual respect works, it applies everywhere. Mutual respect is how you actually do deal with everybody, irrespective of what country they're from, what culture they're from. That if your fundamental setting is, hey, I want to talk to this person. I want to meet this person. I want this person to be able to engage with me because there's a lot that I need to learn. I want to engage with this person because I'm lucky. I've got a huge number of assets here and I should be able to share some of those. So if your basic attitude is we, both of us, are in a position to work with each other, to assist each other, and I sound as though I'm a sort of thinking out in the future, some sort of sad romantic, but I like the fact that the Americans The Americans put human happiness in their Declaration of Independence.
Absolutely.
And I mean, don't know it's so happy there at the moment, but at least it was a really powerful aspiration. We shouldn't be quite so tight about talking about human happiness and human well-being as a critical measure of how a country operates, how our region operates, how collaboration operates. So,
and in the work you did, for example, with AP4D on human security, you were talking a lot about that, not seeing security as being this dichotomy between state security and individual security, but what happens at the individual level, that's what creates stability and security at the national level. So that development and defence definitely come together.
Yes, I mean, I know it's sort of a trite thing to say, but you can't have a safe nation if you don't have a safe population. Yes. You can't have a strong nation if you don't have a strong population. I mean, Mr. Putin might find out about this yet. It's pretty dangerous there, but we know already that if you don't have a nation which is convergent upon, that is a community which is convergent upon the interests of the nation, that nation will find it very, very difficult to thrive. And we have been a nation which can thrive. I'm simply saying we can thrive much better, and we can work with particularly our immediate region so that we collaboratively can thrive together. That's not poetry. That's just good and sound common diplomatic sense.
Well, can I focus a bit on the Pacific? Because I think a lot of what you're talking about intercultural understanding, working as peers, shared future, I think that works very well in Asia. In the Pacific, we have a very specific history, which makes things a lot more difficult. Yes. What's your vision there for Australia and the Pacific?
Well, first of all, as domestically, we have got to own up to our history. We've got to accept it. Some of the people who are watching our webinar today, Melissa and Ebony, may be aware that I did not like the Prime Minister's Pacific speech delivered in Townsville about 2 years ago. And one of the reasons I didn't like it is not only because it was, I thought, overbearing. I mean, when we start talking about our Pacific family, we're making some pretty big statements, particularly to say that we own it. It's ours. Well, hang on. What do they all think about that?
We have to deconstruct the concept of family there and think about how family applies.
Well, it might be into a tough love family.
Well, exactly. I think there's some really positive ways you can use that imagery, but there are also negative connotations.
People have got to want to belong.
So you've got to
They've got to want to belong, and we have to want to belong too. We can't just think that we can dominate. We've got to think that we've got to belong. So I didn't like the fact that it was delivered in Townsville, for example, because anybody with a bit of knowledge knows that Robert Towns and John Mackay, who set Mackay, the next city down, next big city down in Queensland, they're both slavers. They brought a whole lot of people from Pacific Islands into Australia, and the Colonial Sugar Refining Company built its initial strength on the backs of people from the Pacific. And even when we're thinking about floods in Bega, well, the town that's at the bottom of Twofold Bay, Boyd Town, that was Boyd's town, where he populated it with, I think, almost 70 people who'd come from what is now New Caledonia. And having got there, they said, God, we don't like being here. It's too cold. They all ran away. And what happened to them, I don't know. But he didn't proceed with these intentions to populate that part of Australia with indentured labourers, which is a nice expression for slavery. So our starting point in the Pacific is not such a flash one. And certainly during the 19th century, we largely ignored it. They were British colonies, and they got on with the business of doing whatever they felt like doing there. And during the 20th century, we had 2 wars. We didn't cover ourselves with a lot of glory in the Pacific. And it's only with the establishment of the Pacific Islands Forum that we began to at least engage institutionally in the development of the Pacific. But we've had all of these ups and downs, not just funding ups and downs, but ups and downs in policy. One day it's important, the next day it's not. Suddenly we get scared of China, and what are we going to do? Rush around the Pacific. And what are we going to try to do in the Pacific? Well, we're going to try to tell them that China's not trustworthy, that they can't deal with China, and by the way, we're back. Well, good luck. Maybe that'll succeed. My guess is, though, that the people in the Pacific are far too smart for that. They will know whether we're genuine or whether we're not. And the language we use is the key indicator of whether we're genuine. So if we say our Pacific family, and we treat them with tough love and have serial disdain for the peoples of the Pacific, what on earth can we expect?
Well, and just flipping that again to your positive vision, I mean, what would you like to see Australia doing in the Pacific?
Go there, sit down, shut up and listen. They have a lot to tell us. They've got a lot to tell us about ourselves, and we've got to sit down and listen to them tell us about ourselves. In the same way as we've got to sit down on the ground with Indigenous Australians and listen to them tell us about us. And that's an act of humility, but it's also, more importantly, a huge gesture of acceptance. It's a huge gesture in belonging. And once you get through that initial phase, and I must say, the New Zealand Prime Minister has given us a couple of lessons in how you do that. So there is a model out there. Jacinda Ardern has sat down and listened to the people of Samoa. Tell her what they think about New Zealand. We've got to do the same. And in fact, we've got to do it in New Zealand, because Maori have got a particular view of what Australians are like, and we've got to listen to that. So I think the starting point is to listen. And if we were just to listen for a while and get the vibe, I think we'd be much more successful diplomatically.
Well, look, this has been a fantastic discussion. I want to open it up to our audience as well to hear some of their questions. I took away from the book that Australia must learn to live in, for us, a less predictable world. And I thank you so much for giving us a vision for what that might look like. So back to you, Ebony, to hear from our audience.
Thank you. I feel a bit like back to you in the studio, you know, Barry on Insiders. I can see we've got nearly 400 people on the line with us. Thank you so much. This is the book, No Enemies, No Friends. You can find it at all good bookstores at the moment. And just a reminder, I can see a couple of people have got questions here for the panel. You can type those in that Q&A function, and you can also upvote other people's questions as well if you think there's a couple of good ones in there that we definitely want to get to. Thank you so much for that, Melissa and Allan. That was a wonderful conversation. I'm going to start with a question from Bernard Flynn. He says, Allan, I'm not sure whether you'll get to this in the discussion, which I think we kind of touched on it, but not in any huge way. But it seems that two autocrats in Russia and China have a strong negative view of Western democracies and their free way of life. How can we strengthen and value our nation's democratic principles and posture as a counter to a constant arms buildup?
Well, Bernard, I think that's sort of the question that I'd love really to have tackled in this book, but I wasn't brave enough to tackle it because I felt that I had to settle how we think first before I got into then what kind of broad international geometry should we be pushing for. So your question might provoke the next book. So take responsibility, Bernard. But to answer your question, I think one of the big failures of the West, and this has been for quite a long time now, certainly for 40, 50 years, has been to engage in advocacy for the values and the value, the two different concepts, of the system that has allowed us to build the kinds of societies that we've got. Democracy as is practiced in the West, and we've got different shades of it. We do it differently from country to country, but the idea that the people are the arbiters of who governs them, and the idea that all of us are equal before the law by virtue of the fact that we all have dignity and value by virtue of our shared humanity. And if you think I've just made that up, it's actually paragraph 2 of the UN Charter's preamble. So there's nothing original in what I've just said, but it just sounds really lovely to me. If we were much clearer and much more constant in our advocacy of what that meant and put our diplomatic and development energy where our mouths are, I think that we would not be seeing the nature of the autocracies that we're dealing with at the moment. We would still have autocracies, okay? Because there are cultures which actually have, for 3-4 millennia, worked on the basis of having a paramount leader who is not answerable to the people, but the people are answerable only to the paramount leader. And democracy is pretty new in the way in which we conduct our affairs nationally and internationally. I mean, we were once in an absolute monarchy, or at least our ancestors were once in an absolute monarchy themselves. So democracy is relatively new. And if you want to sort of propagate it, if you want people to behave with each other according to the principles of respect and dignity, then you've got to advocate them and you've got to do it yourself. You don't back losers in wars. That's a good starting point. You don't go to every war that's on. If you're going to go to a war, it has to be to the benefit of the people who you think you're going to be defending. It's not to the benefit of a hegemon anywhere. It's not to the benefit of what might be the ruling elite of that country at the time. So it's very important to engage in that kind of effective, invested advocacy for the principles of democracy. And just remember that in China, after the period of Mao Zedong, when Deng Xiaoping turned up, the Chinese government began toying a bit with what it might look like in a huge country like that with an entirely different culture, to think about what democracy might mean for China. And 1989 was a pretty big watershed because democracy came on a bit fast. And we've seen democracy come on a bit fast in the recent history of the Ukraine, and also, I might say, of Russia. And it can be very difficult when that happens like an eruption. So what we've got to do is to be very much more measured, to encourage people to be much more measured in trying to press for what they want, but being very, very articulate in being able to express the values of what you get for investment in democracy.
And I would add to that I think most societies actually do have, some traditions in there that you can work with, traditions of good governance, traditions of accountability. What you're trying to do is strengthen those traditions to make those governments more accountable and stronger. And they exist in most countries. You just got to work with them.
Yes, exactly. Cultural relativism, people call it sometimes, but it's not really. What it actually is being able to identify the points of convergence that you have between cultures. And in China, it's the golden rule. And we might talk about Immanuel Kant's categorical imperative. I mean, they're different. They've got different intentionalities, but they do meet because they are actually about extending respect to other people and expecting that respect to be extended to you. It's not a bad starting point.
The next question I've got here is from Peter Todd, and I think this probably is a good one for both of you. Allan, first to you, is there a country or a culture we can look to as a good example for how to do things right? You've already mentioned Jacinda Ardern and the New Zealand example in the Pacific, but is there anyone else who we can learn from?
Okay, well, I'm going to start with learning from the First Peoples of Australia, actually. I think to be happy, we have to belong to our continent. We've got to feel comfortable living in our continent. And I mean I don't just mean living on it. And we're going to learn that from the First Peoples of Australia. So I'd start there. And
if you put that even just in international relations terms, which I think a lot of people don't, Australia's First Nations managed different ethnic and cultural groups, different language groups across a continent the size of China or Western Europe, and they did it without the sort of warfare that we saw in those places. They managed wonderful relationships with Macusson trade routes, with people with no common language. There's some really great examples within Australian history in that sense, First Nations Australian history, that I think we should see as also part of our international relations that we can learn from.
Yes. But for external ones, and I mean, the question is a really valid question. I just sort of, I wanted to flip it a bit because I seriously do believe that we've got such a lot to learn ourselves about where we are. But there are other countries which have done that, by the way. They've done it better than we have. I think it is always worth looking at New Zealand because they have a treaty with their First Peoples and it largely works. I mean, people are unhappy with it. A lot of Maori are unhappy with it, but at least it's a good starting point. But I also look often to the Nordics And it's popular in Australia to do that because we have some cultural affinities with the Nordics, they're democracies and they know how to work. But from my point of view, the reason why I particularly look at the Nordics, I'm fascinated by the Finns, and I'm really, really fascinated by the Baltic countries amongst the Nordic group, because they live cheek by jowl with massive major cultures. If you look at the Finns and you look at the Latvians and the Lithuanians and the Estonians, they live cheek by jowl with Russia to the east, or for the Finns to the south and the east, and Germany to the south. And they've had a long period of knowing how to deal with these really major powers with enormous internal strength and enormous internal resources. And they do that very cleverly. And they don't do it by picking fights. They do it by a long practiced process of mutual accommodation, which is what diplomacy is actually all about. That these great powers make demands. You can push them back. You watch Vietnam push back against China over 2 millennia. Watch the Thais push back against China over the same period. And they don't do it by resorting to armed force. They do it by diplomacy. Occasionally there's force, but it's interesting how those provocations are then dealt with diplomatically. So what I'm saying is there are a lot of models for us to look at and learn. And I think for us, start here where we are and then look at those cultures which are most similar to our own, with whom we can talk and from whom we can draw some lessons.
And I agree on the cultures in our region are also very important.
Yes.
So thinking about how does Indonesia or Malaysia or South Korea manage some of the same sort of issues we have to deal with.
Well, I mean, I spend a fair bit of time in this book talking about Indonesia and Malaysia. They're countries I know very well. And the Sultan of Kedah came to Australia the year before last and gave a fabulous speech on how they work things out. And he talked about mashwara, which means conversation, and mufakat, which means agreement. So they build into their cultural practice the capacity to have a conversation. Interestingly, they don't use the word debate, which we use all the time. We like to set everything up in terms of artificial conflict. They use the word conversation. I think we should use that word a lot more. And then agreement, consensus. How do you build that? And they're built in as cultural norms. And frankly, if you apply that to the way in which you conduct your international diplomacy, you're on much firmer ground, I think, than you are if you're simply thinking about where you can get your next load of missiles from.
Thank you. The next question that I've got, I'll come to in just a second, but I did just want to add for people who are interested in a different way of doing foreign policy, and Allan specifically talks about misogyny being a huge problem at the base of how we approach the world. We did speak to the former Swedish Foreign Minister, Margot Wallström, on the webinar series last year, and they have she began feminist foreign policy for Sweden on the basis that a lot of women were excluded from national security and defense discussions, and that certainly where there is conflict, the more women who are involved in peacemaking, the more stable that peace is in the aftermath of conflict, as one particular observation that people might be interested in. The next question.
On that, I'll say, Ebony, there is an Australian feminist foreign policy coalition, so do have a look at that if you're interested in looking further.
Excellent, thank you. The next question is from KC Bowie, who says, Australia has doffed its forelock to the United States. How can we best rid ourselves of our insecurity and make friends?
Read the book.
Yes, that's the long answer. The short answer takes many more words, but I think it is about knowing who we are and what we stand for, having a very, very strong sense of our identity as a nation. And I deal at some length with the problem of the word identity in my book, and I hope that it illuminates at least some part of the discussion on that issue. The word identity is often used to mean a brand, really, and I don't think identity is about branding at all. I think a country like Australia has many identities, and one of the things that makes us a very particular identity is we accept many identities. It's a very important way of thinking about it. But I also think, though, that as we're sort of talking about how we project ourselves, that in the world in which we live, being able to identify and respect and understand the identities of our interlocutors, that is really, really important. We've got to be open to the fact that our neighbours on many important issues think very differently from us. It doesn't mean they think wrongly, by the way. It just means they think differently. And engaging in that conversation means that we ourselves begin to think differently too. That the nature of complex problems, we often call them wicked problems, is that the answers to them are always messy, slimy-wimey, to quote Doctor Who. And we've got to accept that there is a huge amount of fluidity in the positions that we adopt. And you don't seek to consolidate so that there's no fluidity anymore. That gives you stasis. But what you do try to do all the time is to make sure that that fluidity is working to the advantage of everybody who's in that system. And that's the real technically difficult part of an effective, constructive and efficient diplomacy.
Yeah. And I think that intercultural contact always involves a sense of what you need, the confidence, because it changes you. Yeah, if you're doing it properly, it changes you, and so you need to feel confident when you're taking that endeavour.
Yes, and if you can say, "Hey, I wish I'd thought of that," you're on a good start.
The next question is probably a little bit linked here to tugging the forelock to the United States. It's from Richard Bentley. He says, "We've jumped from French subs to AUKUS. Is there a better approach than making submarines the symbol of our defence preparedness?"
I'll just start on this because I think it's a matter that Melissa has actually studied, and I really would like you to talk a bit about that. But just let me start here. I just prepared a lecture yesterday that I'm going to deliver next Monday afternoon at the National Security College here in Canberra. And in that lecture, I'm going to be arguing that we have very, very deep historical relationships with the United States and its antecedents, at least back to the Declaration of Independence. We sometimes forget in Australia that when the First Fleet arrived in 1788, there was a huge debate going on in America about the relationship between the state and the citizen. And those debates showed up in a set of documents called the Federalist Papers. And the protagonists were variously Hamilton. You should see that show. It is fabulous. And you learn a bit about American history in it. But more importantly, it involved people like Madison and Jefferson and a few others. And these conversations are really, really important in understanding the kind of democracy that we have and operate, and the kind of democracy that the Americans operate. And when you have that consonance between the fundamental substrates of our country, you have a very deep relationship. But what do? We create myths about war and we paint the relationship battleship grey. And so the swinging point of our relationship becomes a myth. The ANZUS myth. Is ANZUS important? Well, sort of. Is it very important? No. Why not? Well, because it's inoperable. If you read it, it's a pretty short document, it's 850 words. If you read it, you will work out very, very quickly that the Americans won't do it, and nor actually will we. And read Article 1 very particularly, because it says you shouldn't go to war. So the ANZUS Treaty is what we focus our relationship with the United States on, and we tug the forelock, I think, in the gestures that we give by going to war all the time. I think Vietnam was one of those. I think Iraq was certainly one of those. And I think Afghanistan, not first time around, but second time around, was also one of those. And they ended, I think, in national disgrace. So when we talk about forelock tugging, we've got to remind ourselves that you don't go along with the Americans everywhere they go. You go along with the Americans in the way in which you think about and construct the institutions on which you operate your democracy and the institutions that protect it. And so I'm not arguing at all in that book that we should walk away from the Americans. I am arguing that in that relationship, we should be grown up and independent.
The next question that I've got is from Judith O'Byrne, who says, for decades, various governments have been dismantling and weakening various institutions. How can they be saved? If you both want to have a crack at that one.
Well, I presume that the they here is not the nations who've been doing that, but the institutions that they've been attacking. So I might just talk a bit about institutions. You cannot operate any system without institutions. Our national institutions by which we operate ourselves are something of which we should be really, really proud. I think that we should be very proud of the way in which our parliaments actually work in Australia. I mean, they do terrible things sometimes and stupid things often, but they work pretty well. You know, we have proper obedience to the electoral cycle. We don't have the sort of appalling scenes that we saw after the last US election, where one side refused actually to accept the result and then had a riot about it. So, you know, we should be very proud of our respect for our political institutions. We should equally be very, very proud of our respect for our legal institutions. Our courts do us proud, I think. And having had the privilege myself of meeting so many of the people who work in our legal profession and the judges who operate our courts, I have enormous regard for how that system, that set of institutions operates. Our financial institutions are fabulous. And I mean, we all have bad times sometimes with the bank, I guess, but they don't steal from us. You know, and they protect us when we are stolen from. So I just think that our domestic institutions are really important. The global institutions, of course, are a little bit different because they're voluntary. We've agreed to the way in which we can structure our domestic ones and we don't change them. The international ones, the UN, its agencies, other institutions like ASEAN or the Pacific Islands Forum, they're institutions that in order to keep them operating properly, in order to keep them in that broad sense solvent, you've got to maintain your constant investment in them. And I don't just mean money, though that's important. I mean the investment of intellect and the investment of emotion. Because these are important things. How you feel about them and whether you care about them are really important. And your interlocutors know straight away whether you care about them and whether you feel for them. And I think that that's really important.
Yeah, look, from my perspective, I suppose, you know, from Asia-Pacific Development Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue, we're all about saying those three arms of statecraft that Australia takes into the world need to be properly respected and resourced and coordinate in a way that progresses our interest. No, I think we would be saying that hasn't always happened. No. I think the coordination side is definitely growing, but that idea of respecting and resourcing all of the elements of statecraft for their complementary but distinct roles in shaping the world around us, I think we still have some way to go.
Could I just put a coda on the end of that, Eb, if you don't mind? We have a government that is sort of in a kind of paroxysm about China. Wherever it is, it's in a paroxysm about China in China, and it's similarly deeply concerned about China in the Pacific. China's here, it will stay in the Pacific. It's big, it's large, it's noisy, and it's sometimes pretty rude. But standing up and shouting out that it's big, loud, noisy, and very rude doesn't get you very far. What you do need to do in the Pacific is to engage with China. And again, one of the sort of little recommendations I've put in there just to think about is that a donors conference in the Pacific would be a really important thing to do. A donors conference owned by the recipients, not by the donors, but where the donors go, sit down and listen to the recipients. And China as a donor, it's not nearly as big a donor as Australia is, but potentially it will be a much bigger donor than Australia with a much louder voice to set up the institutions that allow for funding we have a deep interest in. And so instead of a kind of sort of loud hysteria about China. We've got to be much more thoughtful and think about the institutions that will have us all cooperate in creating the kind of peaceful, prosperous world we would like in the blue continent.
Allan, we don't have long to go, but I did just want to ask you, I know there's a section on the book, in the book where you talk about disarmament and our focus in the past on that. And obviously we now find ourselves in a moment where I'm sure we're wishing we invested more in that for the past couple of decades. Can you just tell us a little bit about why it's so important and how Australia has approached it historically?
That's a huge question, Ebony. So I'll try to cut to the chase. I mean, what President Putin has done by raising the nuclear spectre is a shocking and terrible thing to do. The Prime Minister has described it as unacceptable. I think it's much more than unacceptable. I think it is patently immoral, and it should be called out by every country in the world as immoral to threaten the extinction of humanity to win a war against a much weaker neighbour. So it becomes right in focus now because we have a national leader in President Putin who is prepared to contemplate the annihilation of the globe to gather a victory, which in its own right will be mutually assured destruction. That's totally immoral. So disarmament comes back right into the fore again, because once upon a time, and it's a quarter of a century ago, that we were last really active in this, when the government of the day established the Canberra Commission, dumped immediately in 1996, we have a vested interest in a denuclearised world. Article 6 of the NPT Treaty, which is the one about disarmament, has been completely ignored by the nuclear weapon states, whereas Article 3, the one under which all the non-nuclear weapon states live, has been honoured in virtually total observance, with only a couple of parties sliding off into a state of immorality, Iran being one and North Korea being another. And Israel was never a party to the treaty, but Israel has nuclear weapons, and I don't know that's such a smart thing for them either. So when you look at the issues in front of the global community at the moment, whether it's climate change, whether it's the nature of pandemics, whether it's famines which come around about because of pandemics and climate change, or whether it is the threat of total annihilation of the human race, these are the very big issues on which a modern, deeply engaged, liberal, little L, liberal government such as Australia and our many partners around the world, including in Asia, have a deep interest. And we should be advocating that with every bit of energy that we've got.
Well, I can't think of a better point to wrap things up than there. That has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much, Allan and Melissa. That was just wonderful to listen to. The book is No Enemies, No Friends. Can I specifically thank Allan Behm, Director of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs Program and author of No Enemies, No Friends, published by Upswell and available in all good bookstores, and Melissa Conley-Tyler, Program Lead at the Asia Pacific Development, Diplomacy and Defence Dialogue. Thank you everyone for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all, but if you'd like to hear more of Allan, he's about to embark on a national book tour. You can find the details for that on our events page at australiainstitute.org.au. We're launching it tonight in Canberra. He's going to be appearing at a Politics in the Pub at the end of the month in Canberra, but he's also visiting Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Brisbane, I think at the very least are on the list there. So do head on over to our website to find the information for that. Don't forget to listen to our podcast, Follow the Money. The audio from today will go up as a podcast episode, and the next episode we're releasing is on the latest IPCC report on climate adaptation. Thanks so much for joining us today and your interest in this book. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next week, hopefully. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Ebony.
Thank you, Ebony.